So while the last video that we did took a look at Mary's foreign policy, looked at her marriage in a little bit of detail, and talked about her economic policy, today we're going to be talking about a little bit more about Mary's marriage to Philip and the problems it caused her. And we'll also be talking about her religious policy, which a lot of historians have said is one of the major problems with Mary. So this really looks more at Mary's problems as a ruler. The other thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at what historians have said about Mary I. And we'll be looking mainly at two schools of thought about her. The traditionalist view, which really sort of exists from about the time she reigns up until the 1970s, and then we're going to be taking a look at the revisionist view. And the revisionist view is going to be looking at some sort of different evidence, but it's also going to be looking at the evidence that previously had been used by historians in a slightly different way to come to a slightly different conclusion about what we should think about Mary's reign. So let's get started. Okay. Historians, when they talk about Mary, tend to say that, in fact, when you look at the failures of Mary, they stem from two things. First of all, her insistence on an alliance with Spain. So the fact that she tends to distrust English advisors, and she insists on, first of all, marrying Philip II of Spain, and second of all, continuing to listen to the advice of the ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire, Simon Renard. And remember, he also has Spanish connections because Philip II is the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And the second thing that people say is really Mary's key failure as a queen is her Catholicism, and specifically the sort of fanaticism that she brings to her religious beliefs and her sort of her crusade to change England back from a Protestant country to a Catholic country. A lot of people say that ends up being such a sort of what could be called an idea fix, or a fixed idea, a goal, that it turns from being sort of a political decision, and it turns into, again, this sort of religious crusade, which doesn't prove to be helpful to her as a leader. We'll take a look at that. The first thing we should talk about is the problems that are brought about by Mary's marriage to Philip. And the very big problem that is brought about by this is what's called Wyatt's Rebellion. So this is an elite rebellion, and I really want to emphasize that this is led by some of the nobility in England, which shows you that Mary is still serving over a divided country. Some people in the nobility support her very much, others are still looking for another person to support, and you're going to see that sort of centers around Mary. And first of all, the major concern, what the short-term cause of the rebellion is that Mary has announced that she's going to be marrying Philip of Spain. And the nobility who take part in this rebellion are really concerned that if Mary marries a Spanish prince or a Spanish king, that English courtiers, English advisors, English nobility are going to lose power within their own country. And there's this real fear that England, again, is going to be sort of taken over by Spain. But I think it's also important to note that Wyatt's Rebellion, while the marriage to Philip is definitely a sort of short-term cause for that, this rebellion has actually been being planned since before Mary announces her marriage to Philip. In fact, they're hoping it's going to happen in the spring of 1554, so April, May, June of 1554. The fact of the matter is that the announcement of Mary's engagement to Philip causes everybody to sort of put this a little bit closer at hand. So they move the rebellion up. And the plan behind the rebellion really tells you that it's not just the Spanish marriage that's concerning these people. Because the plan is that they're going to rebel, they're going to remove Mary from the throne, and they're going to place Elizabeth on the throne, and they will then marry her off to Edward Courtenay. Now, you may remember from the last video that Edward Courtenay was the English candidate for Mary's hand in marriage. The other thing to note is that Elizabeth and Edward Courtenay are both Protestants, whereas Mary is Catholic. So as you can tell, there's definitely, again, this religious component to what's happening. And there tends to be a sort of religious component to all of these rebellions we see happening in the Tudor time period, as you'll probably have noticed from the rebellions that Edward saw, so the Western Rebellion and Cat's Rebellion, but also obviously from Wyatt's Rebellion. Okay? And then I think the last thing to remember is there's certainly a political component to this rebellion. There's a religious component to this rebellion. There's also an economic component to this rebellion, just as you'll remember there was certainly in Kett's rebellion and to a certain extent even in the Western Rebellion under Edward. And that economic component is that, as you'll remember from the last video, England is still not doing terribly well economically. They've had a series of bad harvests, inflation is continuing, Mary's trying to get it under hand, but by 1554 she hasn't been able to do very much, it's still very early in her reign. And a lot of the ordinary people of England are concerned about the economic status of the country. And so a lot of the people who take part in this rebellion, the sort of rank and file, the men who are actually carrying the arms and the supporters, the people who are supporting these wealthy this gentry and this nobility in this rebellion, those people a lot of times are really rebelling because of economic issues. So you have to remember that for Tudor rebellions, there's sort of three things going on. It's about political power, absolutely. It's about religion, absolutely. But it's also about economic trouble, and particularly for the people who are sort of serving as the mass of the rebels, a lot of this is actually about economic policy. The rebellion ends up actually being fairly unsuccessful. So because they have pushed the rebellion up from when it was meant to happen in spring, most of the people don't really manage to actually get the troops that they wanted to get together. So for example, the Duke of Suffolk, and remember this is not Charles Brandon, this isn't the brother-in-law of Henry VIII, this is Charles Brandon's son-in-law. It's the man who's married Charles Brandon's daughter. And importantly, this Duke of Suffolk is the father of Jane Grey and of Catherine Grey. Jane Grey, as you'll remember, is the person who was put on the throne briefly before Mary. He's managed to get Mary's goodwill. He's convinced her initially at the start of her reign that he didn't really support his daughter being made queen, that was all Northumberland's idea, so he's gotten his freedom. Well, now he's taking part in a rebellion, and as you can imagine, this is not going to turn out well for him, and it's not going to turn out well for his family. Not only that, so it's not going to turn out well for him, it doesn't even begin particularly well for him, because he only manages to actually get about 150 men to join him. In fact, the only person who does manage to get a significant number of people to join him is this guy. And that is Sir Thomas Wyatt. And that's why this rebellion is called Wyatt's Rebellion. Okay? It's basically named after him because he's the only one to get a significant number of people together. So here are the problems with this rebellion. Obviously, the first big problem is that they don't get enough support. So Wyatt is the only person to really raise a large number. He only gets about 3,000 supporters. There's a question of how much that is, but it's not a ton. Okay? It's not really enough for probably a very successful rebellion. The second problem is this nobility have let Edward Courtenay in on the secret that they want to put him on the throne. And Courtenay begins to become a little bit nervous as he sees that the rebellion isn't really getting the numbers it needs. And he lets the secret out. So pretty soon people discover that actually this rebellion is planned. Mary sends out the Duke of Norfolk, and yes, believe it or not, this is still the very same Duke of Norfolk who was Anne Boleyn's uncle, who was Catherine Howard's uncle. He is at this point in his 80s. For some reason, he is still being allowed to lead groups of soldiers out. So they send him and his men out to crush the rebellion. The problem is, he's not a terribly good military leader by this point, and his men actually join the rebellion. Luckily for everybody, there aren't a ton of men going out with the Duke of Norfolk. So his men do actually join the rebellion. But for all of that, Mary basically shows very, very good bravery. She stands firm in London. She says, I'm not leaving. I am the queen. This is my city. And she makes a very inspiring speech to the people of London, reminding them that they should follow her because she is their queen, that she's not afraid, they should not be afraid. So when Wyatt actually tries to bring his men into London, basically the people of London just lock the gates and keep him out. And pretty soon, Wyatt's men, who realize that they're not going to get into London and this is not going to be a successful rebellion, begin to trickle home. So his forces just basically desert him. And essentially what Mary does is she's ended this rebellion just by letting it burn itself out. It's just not a successful rebellion. She does arrest Wyatt, and she does behead him, with the sort of idea being this will remind people that they shouldn't rebel against her. She also is going to behead the Duke of Suffolk. And sadly, because Mary sort of realizes that this rebellion does mean that there are people who are against her within her upper class, she decides that she needs to remove threats to the throne. So she needs to remove people who could potentially be placed on the throne instead of her. Now, she can't bring herself to actually kill her sister, which shows family feeling, but she does have Lady Jane Grey put to death. And she has Guildford Dudley, Lady Jane Grey's husband, put to death, with the idea being that, aside from Elizabeth, these are probably the two people who would be the center of any rebellion. These would be the other two that people might want to put on the throne instead of Mary. You have to feel sorry for Lady Jane Grey and her husband, who had absolutely nothing to do with this rebellion, and probably didn't want it to happen in the first place. But, as you know, sometimes as a queen or a king, you have to make very tough decisions, and that's what Mary does here. The second thing that historians have said was a major problem for Mary, and as you can see, Wyatt's rebellion ends up actually not being as big of a problem as you might imagine, is that they say that Mary's Catholicism ends up being a big problem for her. Let's talk a little bit about what that Catholicism is and how it plays out under Mary. As I've already said, Mary is a fervent Catholic, and she's probably become more and more devoted to the Catholic cause as she grew older, as she saw her mother abandoned, her father's turning away from her mother and towards Protestantism, makes her see sort of Protestantism very much linked with this idea of abandonment. And so it really sort of causes her to become just incredibly devoted to the Catholic Church. Honestly, most of the people of England are not terribly surprised that Mary is going to try to return England to Catholicism. They know she's Catholic. They realize that when they put her into power. While for most of them, putting Mary into power was very much not about sort of saying we love Catholicism. It was much more about saying we think that Mary should be the next queen because she is the eldest daughter of the king, and that's just how this works. Certainly, they're not so anti-Catholic that they have a problem with Mary coming in. Mary's mistake, as most historians see it, is that she is convinced, because of this sort of religious fervor, that when people are enthusiastic about her becoming queen, they're enthusiastic about it because they're enthusiastic about Catholicism. They're not. They're enthusiastic about the legitimate daughter of a king becoming the queen. They're much less sort of fussed in general about Catholicism. And I think this sort of belief that people are excited about Catholicism leads to Mary ignoring good advice, including actually from some Catholic bishops who say that you need to keep the movement to Catholicism slow, give people time to sort of return to the faith. She wants it to happen all at once because she deeply believes that until England's a Catholic country again, it's basically living in a state of sin. So she sees the need for it to happen quickly. She can't accept that this needs to be a sort of a slow movement. Okay, so that's sort of another big problem with Mary's return to Catholicism. Okay, and let's talk about some of the reasons why returning to Catholicism could be problematic. First of all, when Henry proclaims that he is the head of the Church of England, he very much uses this idea that England should have a church in and of itself. It should have a national church. And the leader of that church should be the leader of the country. And so Henry sort of makes out that one of the problems with Catholicism is this idea that it's a foreign church, that it's led by somebody who's living in Italy who's not English. And while the people of England are sort of mixed on whether they really like Protestant ideology or not, many of them do agree with this idea that they don't particularly like their church being run by somebody who's foreign. So over the time of Henry VIII and through the time of Edward VI, the people of England have really become accustomed to the idea that their church should be headed by an English person. And they don't particularly want to go back to foreign leadership. They see that as sort of giving English power to a foreigner. So there's a sort of reluctance to return to rule by the Pope, which is, of course, a very, very major part of Catholicism. You can't really have Catholicism and not be ruled by the Pope. So Mary's sort of fighting against this idea that the English actually want their church to be headed by an English person. And the second possible problem is that if you go back to Rome, what happens to all of those lands from the monasteries that Henry VIII closed? And what happens to all of those lands from the chantries that Edward VI closed? A lot of that land has actually been sold off to the nobility of England and to the gentry. And you'll remember that actually this means that a lot more people in England, a sizable number of the sort of elite, are now landowners, and that this is actually going to possibly be a big problem if Mary now wants to say, we need to return this land to Rome. So Mary is sort of fighting with these two problems with Catholicism. And I'm really sorry, I don't know why the bottom of this cut off. I actually tried to change it so that it wouldn't, but looks like it still did. But let's just talk through what actually happens as Mary tries to turn England back to a Catholic country. So very, very soon after she is crowned queen, she gets Parliament to suspend the Second Act of Uniformity, which was put into place under Edward and made England much more Protestant than it had been before. And Protestant passes basically what's called the First Statute of Repeal, which is a repeal law. It's a law that is removing previous laws they have passed. So what the First Statute of Repeal does is it actually gets rid of Edward's reforms. So she has now turned England back, not to Catholicism in 1553, but back to the state that England was at the end of Henry VIII's reign. So basically that's sort of right between Catholicism and Protestantism, okay? And there's absolutely no public outcry, which Mary sees as a very good sign. Quite honestly, most of the people in England by this time, aside from a few, are more or less very blasé about what's happening in religion. If you've lived through the end of Henry VIII's reign, if you've lived through Edward VI's reign, if you're now living through Mary I's reign, there's a sort of sense that, okay, the king or the queen is going to change religion, just go with it. So a lot of people just say, all right, so now we're back to the way things were at the end of Henry VIII's reign. Fine, let's see what happens. Okay. And then in 1554, Mary is going to go a little bit further. Okay. She gets Stephen Gardiner, who you may remember was a bishop with very Catholic leanings who had served under Henry VIII. He becomes much less important towards the end of Henry VIII's reign because he's so very Catholic, and he's basically not going to be powerful at all under Edward VI because, again, of his Catholic leanings. But now that Mary is in power, he's sort of back on top. He's back being powerful. And he's going to try to get Parliament to reaffirm heresy laws. And essentially what this would allow them to do is Mary would be able to attack anybody that she believed was going against church laws. And this would, again, as you can imagine, be Catholic church laws. Now, Parliament here is going to stand up to him. And in particular, the House of Lords, which had a lot of bishops in it, because bishops are considered religious lords, just as a earl or a duke would be considered a lord in the secular realm, the sort of worldly realm. You've then got bishops who are considered sort of the lords of the church. So the House of Lords blocks this because there are still a lot of Protestant bishops around. And so Stephen Gardiner very quickly and very efficiently just gets rid of Protestant bishops and replaces them with Catholic-leaning bishops. Okay? And at that point, he then says, all right, well, now I've gotten rid of the Protestants who blocked my bill. And he decides to not immediately attempt to reaffirm the heresy laws. So he doesn't try to pass the bill again quite yet. But what he does is he, again, sort of begins to turn the church back. So he says, you need to enforce the rules of Henry VIII. And what this should say at the bottom is this includes making any married clergy abandon their families. So under Edward VI, clergymen, priests, pastors, whatever you want to call them, were allowed to get married because that's the Protestant way of doing things. So Edward VI priests can get married. Okay? But Edward, as you know, is gone. And of course, that also means that Edward's ideas are gone. And now, priests cannot get married under Mary I. And of course, this causes problems because it's not as though all the bishops died or all the priests died when Edward died. You've got a lot of people who've served under both Edward and Mary, and they're now being told you have to get rid of your wife. Some of them just decide to move abroad. They say, essentially, I'm not going to get rid of my wife. I will not say that my family is not legitimate. Because, of course, lots of these priests who have married now have children, and they're being told you have to abandon your children, more or less. So they say, we're not doing that. I'm going to move abroad to a firmly Protestant country and live there with my family. And so quite a few do, but most of them, honestly, just sort of go along with it. Again, they don't see really the need or the use of fighting against a king or a queen that has made a religious decision. Now, of course, as you can imagine, while they technically abandoned their families, the next problem is that then you actually see a lot of outcry because all of these priests or these pastors or whatever you want to call them, these church leaders, are then going back and visiting their families. And there's a question of how much they should be allowed to visit their family. Because, of course, even if you're telling them you have to abandon your wife, you don't want them to completely abandon their children. So to what extent can you allow them to visit their children? At what point does visiting your children probably turn into just actually still living with your wife and your family and doing things the way Mary doesn't want them to be done? So obviously there are issues. This, again, goes a bit more smoothly than you might expect it to go. And the next big thing to happen in England is that Cardinal Reginald Pole arrives in November of 1554. Reginald Pole is yet another cousin of Mary. He is descended from the Plantagenet kings of England. So he's actually descended from the family that had Richard III, Edward IV, and Elizabeth of York in it. So he's sort of descended from kings. He never has any real desire to make a claim on king in his own right, but he is able to use his sort of social status under Henry VIII before Protestantism arrives in England. He turns into a very important religious leader. And he is very much on the forefront of refusing to follow Henry VIII's rules when Henry VIII turns England into a Protestant country. So he flees back to Italy, and he eventually sort of makes his way into the court of Rome with the Pope. He becomes cardinal, and now in November of 1554, he's being sent back to England in order to restore Catholicism to England. And in 1554 and early 1555, Parliament is going to pass a law that revokes the royal supremacy. And as you should remember, hopefully, the royal supremacy is that law that said Henry VIII was the head of the Church of England, and that the kings of England had always been the head of the Church of England. Okay? So Parliament has now gotten rid of that supremacy. They do, however, ensure that there is a clause within the law they've passed, revoking the royal supremacy, that says anybody who had bought church land has their property rights protected. In other words, if you've bought land that used to belong to a monastery, you cannot have that land taken away from you. So essentially, you're protecting the property rights of people, even though religiously you're turning back the clock and you're saying that actually the leader of the church is again the Pope rather than the King or the Queen of England. Okay? At this same time, Parliament is going to restore heresy laws, which means that Mary and Reginald Pole, as the leaders of the church, are going to be able to try in court those who fail to comply by the rules of Catholicism. And it's at this point that a lot of Protestants, fervent Protestants, are going to flee England because they realize that the writing is on the wall, that if they want to continue practicing Protestantism, they are going to run into some serious trouble. So we think that somewhere around, I want to say it's 80,000 people No, I'm sorry. That's absolutely wrong. It's 800 people. So it's only 800 people basically flee England that we know of for religious reasons. Now, it is possible, unfortunately, that some other people might be moving from England to the continent, and it's not clear whether they're leaving for economic reasons or if they're leaving for religious reasons. But we can sort of assert that about 800 people are actually leaving England in order to escape heresy laws. And the question is that a lot? Is that a little bit? And again, the problem is because there is at this point, you don't think about it, but there is at this point quite a lot of movement between England and the continent already. It's hard to know sort of how many people we should expect to be leaving, how many people might be leaving who aren't directly saying, I'm leaving because I don't want to be prosecuted for heresy, versus how many might actually be leaving with that as part of the reason. So it's very unclear just how many people are really sort of escaping England because of this, which is unfortunate, but again, sort of one of those problems with the amount of evidence we have from this time period. It's not, because record keeping wasn't amazing, it's not always clear why people are doing things, okay? So we do know that some people are fleeing England. We don't know sort of if we should consider the 800 number a large amount or sort of just, well, you can expect that, okay? So it's a little bit fuzzy there, to be perfectly honest. And I'm really sorry that, again, this slide appears to have been cut off despite me trying to fix it. So I really apologize, but let's talk through it. So what is important is that Mary very quickly is going to use her power to execute Protestants. Okay, she sees the execution of Protestants as necessary and vital for England to return to the Catholic Church and to sort of not replenish its sin, but rid itself of sin. So she sees these Protestants in particular as leading people into false religion. And for that reason, you're going to notice that right underneath it says she executes 274 Protestants. It includes a lot of bishops. Obviously, the big one is Thomas Cranmer. And as you can imagine, Mary has had an enormous grudge against Thomas Cranmer because he is the one who sort of helps her father in setting aside her mother. She sees him as the sort of spearheader of Protestantism in England, and so she sees him as the person who's most leading the people of England astray, leading them from the Catholic Church. So it's very important to her that she gets Cranmer to be executed. Then she's also going to sort of follow with the biggest thinkers of Protestant England, and that would include people like Hugh Ridley, Thomas Latimer, and I believe it's Thomas Hooper. But anyway, these are sort of three major bishops who all support Cranmer and are very, very clearly sort of the leading Protestant thinkers of the day. What you should know is, yes, absolutely, Mary, in executing 274 Protestants by 1556, and more in the years after that, this is definitely more executions than you've ever seen in any other Catholic country at this time. So this is more executions for heresy than you see anywhere else at this time. But the important thing to remember is at this time, it's italicized for a reason. Other Catholic countries absolutely have executed Protestants or executed what they believe are heretics in much larger numbers than Mary does. Okay? In fact, some historians have reckoned that if you look at the number of executions that Mary carries out as opposed to her father, they believe she's actually executing fewer people. Obviously, for Henry, the executions aren't just about religion, while for Mary they primarily are, but that gives you a sense. So yes, it's important to note that she is very much bloody in the sense that she's executing a large number of people. However, when we put it into perspective, she is probably not quite as outrageously bloodthirsty as a lot of people sort of claimed that she is. Now, as you can imagine, the outcomes of this persecution are going to cause problems for Mary. First of all, people don't like persecution, and that's just sort of a fact of human nature. So they begin to associate Catholicism with repression. They begin to associate it with people being executed for holding different beliefs. And they begin to associate it with foreign power over England even more clearly. And so you get some people sort of turning away from Catholicism because they sort of say, well, this is a religion of execution. It's a religion of harshness. I don't want part of that. And in fact, some local governments are going to try to get out of enforcing Mary's laws. They're basically just going to try to ignore them. So that sort of, again, shows you that there's some unpopularity about this. And then I think the other thing to know is Protestants are going to write anti-Catholic propaganda. And the prop should stand for propaganda. So because, as you already know, you've got a lot of English Protestants fleeing the country, or at 800 at least, fleeing the country, what's going to happen is, as they're in Europe, they're going to basically be getting information, and they're trying to convince the people of England that they should return to Protestantism, that possibly they should even overthrow Mary. And so you're going to get a lot of Protestant anti-Catholic propaganda, which begins to filter into England. And a lot of historians, when they look at this, sort of assume that this propaganda means that everybody really, really hated Mary and hated Catholicism. But of course, it's really important to remember that, quite obviously, the group that is being repressed is much more likely to write critically about the other side than is the group that's doing the oppressing. So Catholics feel less need to sort of write anti-Protestant propaganda at this point, because they're the ones in the majority now. They're in power, at least. So they don't feel the need to write terrible things about about Catholics, because they have the power to take action. While the Protestants, who very much don't have that power, they need to write anti-Catholic propaganda. So part of the reason why you actually see a lot of anti-Catholic propaganda is because the people who are writing it have something to prove. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and once again, I'm really sorry. This is cut off yet again. It's very, very frustrating. So let's talk about the second bit of outcomes. First of all, despite the fact that obviously Mary and Reginald Pole are both very, very enthusiastic, what you can say is by the end of Mary's reign, the return to Catholicism is piecemeal. In other words, it's happening in small bits in different places, not necessarily fully overall over the country. And it's not really fully successful, certainly. Here's why. You could say, first of all, Reginald Pole doesn't have a lot of experience trying to do something as major as what he's trying to do in England. So he doesn't have the administrative experience to deal with England. Okay, so he's hampered by this. Then second of all, Mary is actually going to have a major disagreement with Pope Paul IV, who comes into power during her reign. And essentially this disagreement is that Pope Paul IV is very anti-Spanish. And it seems weird to say that about a pope, because why would he care? But remember that during this time period, popes are obviously religious leaders, but they also are political leaders. And so this pope is very anti-Spanish, and of course, Mary is married to a Spanish man. Her policy is pro-Spanish, and so she's going to have some serious disagreements with Pope Paul IV. And in fact, he is going to basically attempt to bother Mary by just refusing to confirm any of her the bishops that she wants to appoint from about 1557 onwards. Mary, showing herself to be in some ways her father's daughter, just decides to ignore this and says basically, yes, I want to agree with the Pope, but in and of itself, I am Catholic. I know that I am. If this one Pope causes problems for me, so be it. And she just sort of says, fine, if you're not confirmed by the Pope yet, take up your seat as bishop. We'll get you confirmed at some point later on. I'm sure we can come to an agreement. So she basically just takes a very practical approach to this. All right. The other big problem is that for Mary to actually turn England back to a Catholic country, she probably needed more funds, because she needs more money to actually set the church back up. She needs money to found colleges and places of learning where Catholic priests can go and be trained, because those basically closed down with the end of Catholicism in England. So she needs more funds, and she doesn't have them. Okay, and the second thing that she needs is time. Now, it's really important here to know that Mary reigns for 5 years. Making something as major as a religious change happen in England, probably it was always going to take longer than 5 years. And some historians have said, actually, if you look at it, the biggest problem for Mary may not have been, that her return to Catholicism was never going to work. So they say it's not inevitable that it wasn't going to succeed. What they say is the problem is that she actually died before she was able to fully make this a success. Okay, so that a big problem for Mary is that she lacks time. All right, and for this one, I'm just writing in already what you need to know that got cut off, because it's probably at this point that we should just talk about Mary's death. So you know what's happened throughout her reign. And by May of 1558, which you may remember is about a couple of months after they've realized that her second pregnancy was also a phantom pregnancy, it was not a real pregnancy, she starts to be reported as very weak and ill, and she starts to be reported as suffering from stomach complaints. She might have suffered from uterine or ovarian cancer. She might have suffered from uterine or ovarian cysts. It's very possible that she was weakening and her immune system was not working very well. But what historians know absolutely did kill her was influenza. So she died of a very, very terrible strain of the flu. And she actually dies of influenza on the 17th of November, 1558, which is, interestingly enough, the same day that Reginald Pole dies. Again, he also dies of influenza. He probably also dies because he's quite old. So, in essence, in this one day, both of the grand champions for Catholicism in England are wiped out. And, of course, because Mary has died without an heir, the person who is going to succeed her is her sister Elizabeth. And it's basically at this point that our syllabus ends. Okay, so Mary has died. She's served for 5 years. She has made some major changes, or attempted to make some major changes to England. And the question is, how do we talk about her as a queen? How do we talk about her as a leader? And that's what we're going to be doing for the next half of this video. Okay, the top got cut off, but this is slightly better at least. All right, so there are sort of two schools of thought, and remember, of course, as always, you don't have to know the names of historians, but it's probably worthwhile sort of knowing that there are traditionalists and revisionists, and you'll remember that there are basically traditionalists and revisionists in every topic we've talked about. So the traditionalists include people like A.F. Pollard and your old friend G.R. Elton, who loves Cromwell, less fond of Mary. Okay? These traditionalists tend to be very much influenced by primary sources that they look at, who were written by Protestants. And the problem with this is that, of course, these Protestants who write about Mary are going to dislike her. They have a reason to have a grudge against her. Probably the most important of these is a guy named John Foxe, who writes this book called The Book of Martyrs, and that should be an A. The Book of Martyrs is basically a book about all of the people that Mary kills, and the reasons why they should be seen as holy religious people because they were killed for their religion. So as you can tell, John Foxe obviously does not like Mary. He has a reason to have a grudge against her, but of course that grudge is going to influence the way he talks, not just about her religious policy, but by the way he sort of views her as a whole. And when historians sort of look at this sort of quite biased in the end primary source, written by somebody who has reason to dislike Mary, of course they're going to sort of take on this idea that in fact she's a very, very bad queen. And so they say a lot of things about her. They say she's unimaginative. And here they're really basically saying she doesn't have any new ideas of her own. She's just trying to turn England back to the way it was. You can't rule that way, especially not in the early modern period, because England is at this point becoming something new and different. They say as well she's overly stubborn. She can't see when her policies aren't working. And she refuses to ever change course. A good leader would do that. And they say she fails in 3 important things. They say her marriage fails, her foreign policy fails, and her religious work fails. And up until the 1970s, this is the basic consensus of historians. Mary is a very bad ruler. She is not successful. She isn't a good queen. She basically should be seen as very unsuccessful. But of course, by the 1970s, you get some revisionists coming in. And these revisionists include people like David Loades and Eamon Duffy. And these people are going to say, actually, if we look at the evidence about Mary, and if we look at it really in an unbiased way, we get a different picture. And I think it's important to note that they're not completely disagreeing with the traditionalists. They're not throwing everything the traditionalists say out. So let's talk about where there's agreement. They say, first of all, that yes, she was probably not the most competent ruler. And they think that indeed her passion for religious change does mean that sometimes she ignores what would be good policy because she's basically so focused on what she thinks is her religious duty. So they think that there are definitely problems with that. She is overly focused on religion and possibly not able to see where she could have made better decisions. And they also say that if you look at her marriage and her foreign policy, they're basically unsuccessful. But here's the big point of disagreement. They say that Mary was hampered as much by circumstance, by things she couldn't change, as by her own decisions. And they also say that if you look particularly at her government and her financial policies, there are actually some areas to praise. So they say, no, her reign was definitely not a full success, but in fact, there were good things about it. And let's talk about what they say about those different things. Okay, first of all, let's talk about revisionist views on marriage. So as we said before, revisionists point out that yes, Mary's choice of Philip II as a husband leads to disapproval from the English, who would have preferred Mary to take on a British husband. They point out that yes, this does lead to Wyatt's rebellion, so it does cause problems. But, and this is a really, really important point, they say that it's not clear that if she had married the British choice, Edward Courtenay, that any part of this issue would have really been solved. They say that, in fact, that would have caused problems in and of itself, different kinds of problems. There wouldn't be a problem with, oh, she's married a foreigner. Instead, they think that actually this would have caused significant infighting among the British nobility, because some families would be very, very unhappy that they now had a king who was from the Courtenay family, when they would say, well, we have as good a right to be marrying the queen as he does. He's giving his family all these positions. He's showing off his power. We don't like an English man being raised above us. Mary, by choosing a foreign king, in some ways solves that problem. Okay? So basically, what revisionists point out is that there probably wasn't an ultimately perfect choice for Mary in terms of marriage either way. She was going to make some people unhappy, whether she chose an English husband or whether she chose a foreign husband. And they say that actually, if you look at it, the major problem of the marriage, aside from the fact that Philip II kept leaving and not being a terribly big part of the marriage, but the major failure of it was that Mary was unable to have a child because she was 37 when she began to rule. Her fertility was obviously already on the decline, and she wasn't able to conceive. She wasn't able to have a child. They believe that actually, if Mary had been possibly younger or more fertile, if she'd had a child with Philip, that a lot of the problems and a lot of the criticisms of the marriage would have disappeared because people would have been thrilled to have an heir to the throne. Okay, so it's important to remember that there's essentially nothing that Mary can do about that. It's a fault of biology and it's a fault of timing as much as it is anything that she decided. So it's basically it's circumstance. It's not Mary's choice. And in terms of foreign policy, revisionist historians say, yes, it's true that foreign policy is ultimately unsuccessful under Mary. And they say it probably wasn't a great idea in the long term for her to go along with Philip's desire for war with France in 1557. But they say you need to point out that there are reasons why Mary might have made this decision, and it's important to know those reasons, so let's talk through that. They say, first of all, when Mary went to war with France in 1557, this actually served a purpose for her, because you'll remember just 3 years ago, she had the nobility of England rallying together against her, or at least some of them rallying against her, some of them supporting her. They're fighting amongst themselves, in other words. And that could be severely problematic for a queen of England. You don't want your nobles fighting against each other. When you go to war with another country, well, all of those nobilities are fighting against that common enemy. They're fighting against France. They're not fighting amongst themselves. So in a way, it actually is helpful for Mary because it gives people sort of a common enemy to go against. Revisionist historians also point out that, yes, the loss of Calais was obviously a big problem in sort of terms of how England saw itself. However, They say it's not an economic disaster. Calais had actually been sort of giving less and less economic benefit to England as the 1500s wore on. And again, this sort of comes into where we talked earlier about the idea of moving from a sort of medieval style of government where everybody's very, very concentrated on Europe and the European peninsula, and towards a style of government that's going to become more and more important as we move into the later 1500s and as we move into the 1600s and definitely the 1700s, which is this idea of a more worldwide form of government. Focused on exploring, focused on looking for new areas, not just focused on Europe. Losing Calais in some ways actually probably allows the English to concentrate less on this old idea of needing to gain France and allows them to concentrate more on this idea that maybe they should be exploring in the rest of the world. Okay? So in some ways, it allows England to sort of turn into a more early modern view of the world. Okay? So in some ways, you can actually say it might be a good thing. And the revisionist historians also point out you have to note that there actually are some successes. Yes, England does lose Calais, but they managed to basically remove French ships from the English Channel. So French ships are never again, for the next 100 years, French ships are not going to attempt to attack British ships in the English Channel, which is a big deal. And the English are actually instrumental in helping to force the French to leave Italy, which does good things for Spain. Now, unfortunately, obviously, that doesn't really help England all that much, but they are involved in something that is successful. So you could say that there is some success in their campaign. Now, in terms of Mary's government, revisionists tend to say, yes, absolutely, it's true that Mary's government was not perfect any more than any leader's government is perfect, but they say that it's certainly not as problematic as earlier historians believe it to be. So earlier historians said that Mary's Privy Council was too large, it was too filled with Catholics, and revisionist historians say, yeah, actually it probably was a bit large. Yes, it was filled with a lot of Catholics that did not necessarily have a lot of experience, but they point out that if you look at Mary's use of administrators, she brings in people who have experience from her brother and her father's reign. Even if she doesn't necessarily agree with a lot of their ideas, she knows that they're good at what they do, and so she puts them into her Privy Council. What revisionist historians do agree with traditional historians on is they do think that there is a very problematic issue with Mary, which is that she doesn't trust her English advisors. So they would say that, like, if you really want to fault Mary on one thing, she is definitely over-reliant on Simon Renard, the ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire. But they say that doesn't mean that her Privy Council didn't essentially work well, and it doesn't mean that Parliament didn't work with Mary well. So they actually say if you look at Parliament, they tend to do what Mary wants. She's successful in getting Parliament to agree with her. And this is something of an accomplishment because Parliament has traditionally not always worked particularly well with kings and queens. So Parliament is very willing to work with Mary. So you can see that certainly the features of government, they're not working against Mary, they are working with her. And that is a big deal. Once again, sorry for the cutoff, but revisionists also say that Mary had some major successes. So let's talk about what those successes are. They say, first of all, and we've already talked about this, she reformed the revenue courts. Okay? So she puts finance, so all financial, or 80% of finance for the court is now under the treasury of the exchequer. And again, you may remember from the last video, the idea behind this is that surveys have shown that all of those courts that Cromwell set up, over time they've become inefficient. Things aren't necessarily getting done as well as they could be getting done. So Mary takes Northumberland's idea from his survey and says, okay, so the courts that Cromwell has set up aren't particularly efficient anymore. Let's make them more efficient. And she realizes that actually one way to make them more efficient is by putting them under one grouping. So you've got sort of one person, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's in charge of all of this. And if things go wrong, you know who to blame. Okay? And that does actually make for more efficient finance and more efficient government. And in fact, that's not going to change dramatically up until the 19th century. So Mary's sort of reforms of the revenue courts her financial reforms, in a lot of ways, they're going to stick around. So they are quite long term. Again, she's going to take this idea that rents paid on royal lands have been static, have been sort of holding steady for far too long. She has the use of the survey that Northumberland did on rents paid on royal lands. She increases the rents as he suggests they should be increased, and that's going to dramatically increase her revenues. At the same time, remember, she also does this for customs taxes. She realizes that as people are importing and exporting things, they've basically been paying the same taxes for years, despite the fact that inflation means that prices are going up in everything else. So she just realizes that actually you could probably charge more for customs tax. And again, that works. It's quite successful, and it increases her revenue. So she's getting more money in. The second thing is that Mary does plan recoinage. So she's going to remove all of those last bits of money that have been made out of debased metal. So have got sort of lots of base metal, less valuable metal in them, as well as silver. She's planning to bring all of that money back in, and she's going to reissue it in the way that it was under Henry VIII, which she knows is going to basically halt inflation. Now, in the end, Mary doesn't live long enough to do this. There's an economic crisis that makes her basically say, now is not the time to actually try to remove money from the market, even though we'd be putting it back in. She says, we need to wait, we need to hold off. And so by 1558, when she dies, it doesn't get done. But in the 1560s, Elizabeth is going to use Mary's plan, and it's actually very successful. Okay. And then remember that the last thing Mary is doing is she's starting to look for new trading partners. She realizes that England is basically sort of trading as much as it can with its traditional trading partners. And so she's looking for places she can set up colonies. She's looking for new sources of revenue from colonies by trying to find things that she can bring in. Okay. And remember, there's limited success. She's sort of just at the beginnings of that when she dies, but she is sort of moving towards probably a good financial decision. And the other thing she does is she sort of realizes that during this time period, Russia is becoming a more and more important country and a more financially wealthy country than it had been before. So Russia is sort of just starting to enter into the European consciousness. And Mary sets up what's called the Muscovy Company. Muscovy refers to the city of Moscow. And she's basically setting up a company to trade with Russia. So again, she's looking for new trading partners, which is a good thing. It's something she needed to do. And there are even more successes. So Mary builds a large number of ships. And you probably know this already, but in general, English people sort of see their protection and their military might as being measured in the number of ships they have. So Mary, by building a large number of ships, in some ways is showing that she's building up England's military. Okay, so she's doing something good for that. She is also going to pass two things. One is called the Arms Act, and one is called the Militia Act. And both of those are reorganizing basically how the government provides arms to the military and how the military is recruited from local areas. And both of those actually make the military more efficient. So things should be working a little bit more efficiently at this point in terms of raising armies and then equipping them to go out and fight. So she's making things more efficient than they had been before. Mary also realizes that England has been spending a good deal of money on Ireland, and that spending that money on Ireland, generally sort of in military outlays to send people to go fight the Irish, Mary realizes it's not actually producing any gains. The Irish are not accepting English rule particularly well, and so she ends up just reducing expenditure on Ireland. She basically assumes, well, we're holding on to Dublin. Anything else, we're just wasting money. Okay, so we're going to keep what we have. We're going to continue to protect that, but we're not going to continue to sort of spend money hand over fist over and over again to try to just take more land in Ireland, because that hasn't been working. So she reduces expenditure on Ireland, which obviously is going to mean she has more money to spend on England. And again, you'll remember sort of under Henry VIII, you still have this sort of very medieval system where officials and courtiers are getting grants from the king, and that's what's making up a lot of their money. That's why they're serving the king. But a big problem with that is because courtiers and officials really want those grants, they're not necessarily acting very efficiently. And what you see under Mary is that she does seem again to have made government more efficient, because what she's done is she's actually managed to reduce the number of grants she's paying to officials and courtiers. So she's showing that she's using fewer of these people to actually do the same amount of work. Okay, so she's making government more efficient. So if we take a look at the overall view of Mary, and sorry for the very top of this getting cut off, but this is sort of the wrap up. Mary absolutely faced financial issues coming in. Like Henry VIII, she's going to have to ask for loans from her nobility, and she's going to have to ask for subsidies or taxes to be raised by Parliament, both of which signal that there are definitely still financial problems. However, on the balance, she does a good job, considering that she inherits significant financial problems from Henry, and that she's also working at a time when other countries are also facing major government problems and financial problems. So both France and Spain are going to basically go into bankruptcy in 1557. They have to sort of admit that they don't have the money that they need to do things. Okay. The problem for Mary is that financial gains tend to be sort of a long-term solution. So a lot of times the financial policies that you put together don't necessarily pay off immediately. And because of this, what happens is that Mary's financial policies, which sort of tend to come in sort of 1556 to 1558, just towards the end of her reign, they continue to pay off in the long term. And that means Elizabeth gets a lot of credit for solving England's economic problems. And she deserves some of that credit, but she's definitely building on Mary's policies. She's getting a lot of credit for basically what Mary's policies are. And as you can see, down at the bottom here, we've also got a little bit on revisionist take on religion, and I'm betting that's going to be cut off from the next slide, so let's take a look at it. So first of all, a lot of revisionists are going to agree that there are problems with Mary's fanatical religious ideology. Let's talk about that more in just a second. So they say, yes, Mary's fanatical religious ideology, her insistence on returning England to Catholicism, those are both major issues. So a lot of revisionist historians do say that that is a problem, and that is something you can't really turn into a success. However, some other revisionist historians, so as you can see, there's not even agreement among the revisionists on this, they say that actually, if you look at it, Mary and Reginald Pole do have some success. So they say her religious policy is not an abject and total failure. Other revisionist historians will sort of say, actually, in terms of religion, that's one major failure for Mary. Okay? But here's what others say. They point out that actually, she manages to get together a group of bishops who are militantly Catholic, and when Elizabeth comes in and tries to return England to Protestantism, they actually all reject those attempts. So in other words, Mary has basically solved the problem of the divided church leadership that was a big problem for Edward, that should be the sixth. So you'll remember that for Edward VI, a big problem was that you had bishops who didn't agree on what to do. Okay. Mary has solved that problem because she's got a bunch of very, very, very Catholic bishops. Okay, so she has basically solved the problem of the church leadership. And the last thing to note is that the sort of more sympathetic revisionist historians point out that there are a couple of things to still mention about Mary's potential for success if she had lived longer. So they say, yes, she absolutely did burn heretics, and to some extent that probably did lead to some controversy and to some disagreement from a lot of the English. So that was problematic in that sense. However, they say, if she had lived longer, if she hadn't died 5 years into her reign, her policy of sort of killing off the most fervent anti-Catholics might have actually led to long-term success. They point to this because they say that if you look at 1558, the number of executions for heresy are going down. And they're not just going down a little bit, they're actually going down quite dramatically. And some people have said, some historians have looked at that and said, well, the number of executions is going down because the people of England have basically just sort of pushed back so much that Mary has given in. And she's sick, and she's not participating as much in government, and so her advisors are just giving the people what they want. But other historians say, actually, if you look at this, we don't really have a lot of evidence that that is what was happening. Okay, so we don't have paperwork that says the reason that we're reducing the executions is because everybody's so sick of them. So historians say, actually, what you might be looking at is something quite different. They say that the number of executions might be going down because actually people are resisting less. In other words, you're not burning as many heretics because there aren't as many heretics out there. People are just accepting what was happening. And so they say that actually, if Mary had continued reigning for another 15 or 20 years, it's possible that the numbers would have gotten even smaller and smaller and smaller, and basically you would have ended up having people who basically, a country that conforms to Catholicism the way Mary wanted. And other historians point out that if you look at the number of heretics burned in general, yes, it is quite a lot, and it's more than you see in a lot of other places in that area, but they say that for the most part, the majority of English people were at least accepting to the return of Catholicism. In fact, some were eager for it. Some had been very unhappy under Protestantism. And historians actually acclaim, some of them, that there's a chance that Protestantism was very much still a minority religion. So it's a religion that is really wholeheartedly embraced by a small group of people. Though, yes, it is a very vocal group of people, and yes, it tends to be a sort of elite group of people. Okay, at the end of Edward VI's reign. So there's a claim, in fact, that what Mary is doing is she's returning England to what was really the religion of the majority. And that the reason that historians have sort of tended to say, oh, what she's doing is terrible, and Protestantism was so influential, is because what you're seeing is a very elite, so an important and a vocal, a very outspoken minority that wanted Protestantism. But what they say you're not seeing, because they aren't writing as much, is that actually, for the most part, the ordinary people of England remain Catholic. So there's this question of, actually, Mary may have just been returning England to what most of the people wanted. Now, is this a sort of full-on, easily argued point? Absolutely not. As you can tell, there's sort of very good evidence both for the fact that Mary's religious policies are really, really unsuccessful and a very, very bad idea. And then there's also some evidence that her policies are probably may not be as unsuccessful as other people have thought. Okay, and that if she had lasted longer, if she hadn't died, they may have been more successful by the end of her reign. So if she'd lived longer and reigned longer, they may have gained more success. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide what you think, okay? In any case, what I would say is you clearly cannot make the claim that Mary I is this wonderful, amazing monarch who does everything right. That's just not going to work. However, I think that you can definitely claim that in many ways she is a very unsuccessful ruler, but you also need to acknowledge that there is quite a lot of evidence that in some ways she was a successful ruler, and that in fact if she had ruled longer, and if circumstances hadn't sort of gone against her in terms of her inability to have a child, and her sort of earlier death than was expected, that actually her rule might be remembered not nearly as unsuccessfully as it is. That in fact, if she had ruled for a longer time, you might be looking at her and saying, actually, her rulership did do some good things. So I think that's clearly very important to remember. All right, that's the end of Mary. When we come back to school, what I want you to do is come in with some questions or any issues that you still have about figuring out what's happening with Mary. We're going to do a little exercise where we pull out what you think are her successes and what you think are her failures. And we're going to talk about sort of where you think there are sort of short-term successes versus long-term successes, short-term failures versus long-term failures. We'll talk about all of that, and then we will be done with the syllabus, and we'll be ready just to move on to doing a lot of revision, okay? As always, just a reminder, if you want to email me any outlines, any actual essays that you've written for practice papers, or just any questions, I'm back in the UK, I have access to email for the most part, and so I should be able to have a look at them and help you out. So feel free to do that. Thank you.